Hey, human geographers. We are talking about topics 1.2 and 1.3 in this presentation, geographic data. So we've got two objectives with this video. You're going to be able to identify different methods of geographic data collection, and you're also going to be able to explain the geographic effects of decisions made using that geographical information. So basically, how do we get geographic data? And then what do we do with it? So you will hopefully get all of these essential understandings and be able to answer these two objectives at the end. So let's first think about identifying those different methods of geographic data collection. So the first method of how geographic data is gathered, and one of the biggest methods, is field work or field observations. They mean the same thing, basically. And this is the act of an individual physically going to a location or a place and recording firsthand information there. When you think about history, primary sources are sources from someone who experienced the event firsthand, right? Made during the time of study. Well, that's basically what fieldwork is it is a geographic primary source. So some examples of fieldwork are, or things that could come from fieldwork include written accounts, travel narratives, media reports, policy documents, interviews, photographs, and ultimately landscape analysis, which is what geographers do. They analyze the cultural landscape. And so you can see I've got a graphic here about the collection and techniques for geographic fieldwork, right? You ask geographic questions, think critically about those questions. You go out and you collect and you record your data. You identify your bias, your opinion, make sure that you are not becoming too biased towards one direction. Present your data in an accurate and meaningful way, analyze and evaluate that evidence and that data, and then eventually come to conclusions based on that data. So very much like a historic inquiry, when you take a bunch of primary sources, you examine your biases and the biases of the sources, and then come to a conclusion about a historic event or topic. It's the same thing for geography, except it's not historic. So another example of field work, this is a big one that you have to know and we're going to keep coming back to, is the US Census. Now, for my students in my class right now in 2020, this is going to probably be review for you because you and your parents filled out the census starting in about March of 2020. So the census is mandated by the US Constitution, and so it's carried out by the US government. So it's the actual US government that's going out and doing field work. And basically, what they're asking is they're taking a survey of how many people live in the United States. Now, not only are those people answering questions about, like how many people live in this house, they're also answering questions about their ethnicity and their race and their economic situation. So, what is their income? So, why? Right? Why did the Constitution say that we had to have a census? Why is the US government doing this geographic fieldwork? Well, three major things. First is the census is what is used to determine our representative districts. Now, our representative districts is basically how we vote for not only our state representatives, but also our federal representatives. So that's one example, and we'll get more into that when we get to the political unit. Another example, which is really important, is public funding, right? So public funding is given to not only the states, but the states give it to the local governments for things like schooling, law enforcement and fire departments, for building highways and maintaining infrastructure. All of this is wrapped up in how many people live in a certain city or a certain district. And so the government has to get an accurate number of how many people are living there before then they can then distribute that money. And then finally, census data is really useful not only for geographers and the government, but also for people who own businesses, because you can see where large groups of people are living, what the demographic information of those people are, and where a good place for your business might be. So, why did you just tell me about the census, Miss Pavley? Well, this is one of the kind of ultimate examples of field work. It's done by an organization, the US government. Now, the second major way that we collect geographic data is through geospatial technologies. This is like just a fancy way of saying technological methods. Okay. So there are four main methods that you need to know about. The first one is called Geographic Information Systems, and I'm going to refer to that as GIS. The second is satellite navigation systems, also referred to as global positioning systems. This is GPS. Remote sensing, and then finally, kind of all of those things get wrapped up together into online mapping and visualizations. I love this little GIF from the movie Up. I don't know if you guys have seen it or not, but the little kid here is using GPS while they're floating in this old man's house in the sky. And he says, it shows me exactly where we are on the planet. We'll never be lost. So this is an example of a geospatial technology that you're relatively familiar with. Now, another kind of important piece here is, what are these things used for? I'm going to give you some real life examples, but kind of just like the broad overarching concept here, though, folks, is that geospatial technologies are used by businesses, organizations, individuals, and government agencies to make decisions. So just like I kind of explained with the census. So let's talk about what these are and some examples of them. So for the first one I have here is for GIS. So GIS is a computer software program. And what it does is it stores, analyzes, displays, and gathers that spatial or geographic data from multiple data sets and maps. So when we're thinking GIS, it's basically like a tool that allows us to put layers on top of one another, both thematic and physical, in order to make a decision, right? And so you can see this graphic shows, the layers of land use, elevation, parcels, streets, and then customers, right? This is just a basic model of GIS. But real life, what is it going to be used for? Well, the first thing that is most common, at least for us, is analysis of crime data. So this is actually really interesting. Here is an example of a GIS program used to analyze crime. So you can see these are all of the police precincts. I can't remember what city this was in. And you can see that it's basically all of the violent crimes from Q2 of 2018 and Q3 of 2018 are shown on the map. And so you can see these little icons, right? So those are examples of one of the layers that was put into this GIS. So obviously the first layer was the road map, right? You can see these roads. And then another layer is these physical features, right? Springbrook Marsh, Rot Creek, etc., right? So there's two layers right away. And now we have this data layer of what are these violent crimes. And this is shown with those little icons in the exact locations where they occurred. And then finally, there is another layer that shows a deeper level of analysis, which tells us the violent crime percentage change from quarter 2 to quarter 3. So, has there been more violent crime? Has there been less violent crime, etc.? Right? So, like, for instance, this red district right here, violent crime was up 7.7% between those two quarters. This district right here is up 100% in those two quarters, right? So, this is an example of how an actual government agency, a law enforcement agency, can use GIS to better patrol the precincts in which they serve these people and help prevent violent crimes from happening. So, another method of geographic data collection that is a geospatial technology is GPS. You guys are probably really familiar with GPS. I really don't go anywhere without using it, I feel like. Um, and so, what GPS actually is, it's not just like on my iPhone, right? GPS are these, hundreds of satellites that are orbiting the Earth, right? Above, kind of in the atmosphere. And they're communicating locational information to our GPS receivers, which are our phones, right? Um, and so it's going to tell us absolute location, right? This is used for navigation purposes. Driving a ship, a car, flying a plane. These are all examples of geographic data that is, or I'm sorry, these are all examples of how I can use geographic data that's given to me through GPS. It's pretty simple. The next one is aerial photography, and this is exactly what it sounds like. It's images that are captured from planes or drones. And so pictures and images are actually really helpful to businesses, organizations, individuals, government, etc. So if you check this out, this is an example of that aerial photography. So you can say it says, in response to deadly and devastating tornadoes in Tennessee, our fixed wing aircraft was deployed to capture high resolution imagery of the tornado's devastating path. Overnight, images were sent to be processed, and the first look at damage provided crucial information to aid recovery efforts within 27 hours. So you can see something like a natural disaster, right? A tornado or an earthquake or a tsunami or whatever. You can use aerial photography to capture these geographic images, this geospatial data, and use it for something like recovery efforts. Um, Here is another kind of like, so, oh, I forgot to mention, this is a side by side, right? So this is what it looked like before the tornado came through. This is what it looks like after. Here's another example. So this is the before of that same area. This is the after, right? So you can tell the severity of the damage. This can be given to insurance companies so people can start rebuilding their houses with insurance money. This can be given to public authorities to help plan rescue missions. It's got a lot of uses. Okay, so next up is remote sensing. So, this is the use of satellites as well, but instead of broadcasting information like latitude and longitudinal coordinates, what remote sensing is going to do is it's going to use cameras or sensors, sensing, um, to collect digital images, right? So these are like satellite images, which again, you are probably pretty familiar with. You see a lot of satellite imagery. So, one example that you're probably super familiar with is if you've ever watched the news and seen the weather. That is an example, the kind of Doppler radar. This weather monitoring technology is an example of geographic data, and it's an example of remote sensing. So, there is a sensor on a satellite kind of orbiting the Earth that's giving that data to the newscaster. Now, I think that this is an incredible application of geospatial data here. It's very interesting. So I'm going to minimize my face so you can actually see it. Um, Okay, so what this is an example of remote sensing that was used by Amnesty International to monitor North Korean prison camps. And so I'm sure that I hope you have the background knowledge to know that North Korea is one of the most oppressive places in the world, if not the most. And you can see North Korean authorities are not allowing human rights investigators to access their country, right? North Korea is basically blocked off to everybody in the world. And so instead of actually going there on foot to monitor human rights abuses and the way that these citizens are being treated, Amnesty International used remote sensing, this satellite imagery, to look at basically these political prison camps, these concentration camps in North Korea. And so you can see here, this is a quote from a person who either escaped or was released from one of these prison camps. He said, "We worked in the farms from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. We cultivated corn. We were divided to work in units comprising 10 to 15 people each. We were given a daily production target that we had to meet. If the unit did not meet the daily target, the unit members were punished collectively. During the course of our 3-year detention, often we did not meet our targets because we were always hungry and weak. We were punished with beatings and also reductions in our food quota. In addition to that, in the ideology struggle sessions that were held after work, those who did not meet the target were severely criticized and beaten by other inmates." So there's a lot of information in that quote. But what we can do as geographers looking at remote satellite imagery is compare what this person says in their firsthand account to actually what is going on in North Korea with this photo. So you can see, and let me move my light here so I can actually see. Um, this remote sensing was able to basically photograph this prison camp. And so you can see here are the housing structures. This is the granary. This is a facility under instruction, an industrial facility, more housing structures, right? So you can see there's rice paddies, fish farms, and he's saying that, in the prison camp he was cultivating corn. And so it looks like in this prison camp that we're looking at here, they're probably cultivating fish and rice, right? And that's the forced labor. Um, and so, what Amnesty International did with this project is they took pictures in 2010, which is what we're looking at here. And then they also looked at remote images from later in 2013. And they saw that these camps were expanding. There were more housing structures being built, there was more land under cultivation, which means there are more prisoners, right? And so, this is another example of how we can use geospatial data as a government, right? We make a lot of our public policy based off of how other countries treat their citizens, if they uphold standards of democracy, whatever. So, this is important for us to know and our government to know. This is important for organizations like Amnesty International that's doing outreach to try to help people that are experiencing human rights abuses, right? There's so much that can be done here. And so this leads us to the end, right? Um, After kind of watching this video, you should be able to identify different methods of geographic data collection. We talked about a few. We talked about field work and then geospatial technologies. And then there's a few different examples of geospatial technologies like GIS, GPS, aerial photography, and remote sensing. Right? And we use all of these geospatial technologies in order to make decisions, right? As individuals, as governments, organizations, and businesses. So, like always, if you have any questions, let me know in class.